Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are across Canada, and there's 6 time zones, of course, across the great country of Canada. Welcome to Funding Futures. This is our webinar where we're presenting the Funding Futures report, but with a very much a Canadian focus, hopefully. It was a North American study, and we worked with US Travel in the US, and we're grateful to work with Destination Marketing Association of Canada. And I'll introduce the rest of our presenters and panelists in a moment, but Kathleen is with us. Hello, Kathleen.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the great report. And DMAC was very pleased to assist and partially fund the Canadian edition. So we're really happy to have this conversation, and it's an important conversation.
Thank you so much, and thanks to DMAC and all the participating DMOs, including Royce and Kathy, who are with us today, and we also held a panel of Canadian DMOs. So let's introduce our presenters and panelists for today. My name's Chris Adams. I look after research and insights at Miles Partnership. We've been around 65 plus years and work with destinations, and have worked in Canada in the past. We're also joined by a great team from our agency partners. So clockwise, Erin Francis Cummings is President and CEO of Destination Analysts, and they donated their time to run the research, including a Canadian component of that research. Adam Sachs, a well-known face, President of Tourism Economics. You'll be hearing from Adam presenting the economic recovery story and the outlook for that recovery. And then Tiffany Gallagher is with Civitas, and Civitas was another one of our lead agency partners on this whole project. And Tiffany will be helping me present today and will be moderating the panel discussion. So with the panelists in mind, we've got a great group of panelists that spans Canada. So joining us from Vancouver on the West Coast, Royce Chin is President and CEO of Tourism Vancouver. Kathy Duke, all the way over on the other side, is from Destination St. John's, and Kathleen Trainer, who is a very familiar face, of course, with DMAC. Is also Executive Director of Tourism Barrie. I don't know how you do it, Kathleen. Must be extremely busy. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. In a moment, I just want to give thanks before that, not in addition to DMAC, the Destination Council of US Travel, Destination Analysts for their time and effort, and of course, Destination International contributed time and input and resources into the project as well. Most of the time and effort, though, into this project between Miles Partnership, Civitas, and Tourism Economics was donated pro bono. So we were grateful for some funding support from both US Travel and DMAC, but most of the many hundreds of hours was donated by the 3 agency partners to provide a resource to DMOs to tackle this critical issue. And if we just have a quick look at upcoming resources, so we're actually going to be diving into some of the individual topics in a series of upcoming webinars, the first of which is next Tuesday. We're going to be looking at reserves and short-term rentals. We'll talk about both briefly today, but we'll have additional content, expert speakers. All of the report, the full report, the section reports, the slide sets, recordings, etc., all available on that website. You can see right there, milespartnership.com/fundingfutures. We've been collaborating with a European group on a similar study. So the NOW group is supported by ECM and ETOA, European Cities Marketing. We've included a range of European examples, but they have got a dedicated European study that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. And we're looking at a transatlantic North American European webinar looking at the sort of key findings from both studies in October. So more on that shortly. So we're going to dive into the individual elements here, looking at the situation analysis first to provide a brief overview of the project. We'll be looking at the research results with Erin Francis Cummings. Adam will share the recovery scenarios. Tiffany and I will introduce a selection of the 10 newer enhanced funding options. We'll talk about some recommendations. We'll have a panel discussion. We'll even fit a poll in if we can. And then hopefully after all of that, and we've got a lot of information to cover, obviously, we'll have a Q&A session. So all the slides, the information will be available. So we'll be covering a lot today, but you'll have the resources shared with you after this webinar. So let me pass over to Tiffany, who's going to introduce the project overview and have a quick look at what is the current situation.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the introduction. We're really excited to review this project with you and be able to provide you with some background on this report. We partnered with these great agencies to take a comprehensive look at DMO funding and detail some ideas for all of you to help you with your current funding amidst the pandemic, of course, was the inspiration for this project. So we took an in-depth review of really the foundation of this project was a study that we did, Civitas did with US Travel a couple of years ago that took a look at the charges applied to guest room folios in the top 100 destinations in the United States. We then took that foundation and updated that you will find all in the report as well. We held state and provincial discussion and focus groups with DMO leaders. We asked them for their thoughts on the current state of funding and their thoughts on future funding. We conducted a review of the past crisis of 9/11, the great financial crisis, of course, how that is relative to what we're experiencing today and how that might impact the future. We did a survey of local DMOs, provincial and state travel offices, and we took a look at the outcome for the projections for recovery. You will hear from Adam Sachs on the details of that. We provide you with 10 enhanced funding options. We detail those in the report. And of course, we want to leave you with recommendations and action items for you to take for your futures. And then we will follow up with detailed webinars and resources following this webinar to break it down further. And Chris will speak a bit about the European opportunities in front of us as well. So we began this process because of the current pandemic. We asked some questions in our survey that inspired the beginnings of this project. You reported, Canada in particular, that you project your funding to be down 41.5% for 2021. That is exceeds the reports by United States DMOs. In addition to that, you're looking for new ways to fund your organizations, more diverse and stable sources of funding. So we detail that in this report for you.
So why don't we dive into the research in a little bit more detail. And so let me welcome in Erin Francis Cummings from Destination Analysts, a very old friend, and again, who contributed their time and effort at no cost into this study. And so wonderful for you to join us, Erin. Can you give us a quick overview of the research results?
Yes, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you to bring in the DMO perspective from the survey that we conducted in support of this endeavor, and it'll just be some brief highlights. So the survey was sent to 25 Canadian DMOs who participated in a 2019 DMAC-led tourism funding study, as well as the U.S. state tourism offices and a select group of 100 U.S. DMOs that were part of that Civitas study that was just cited. So we collected data from 115 of these organizations overall. You see here 14 of the Canadian DMOs responded. And on the next slide, please. A really critical first step in assessing the paths forward for tourism funding is inventorying what functions and responsibilities these organizations are currently tasked with. And as we see here, there's a lot. Canadian DMOs are responsible for 8.2 of the 16 responsibilities that we tested. And interestingly, the organizations at the bookends of the tourism funding spectrum, so those with the largest and the smallest budgets, they report having actually the highest number of functions fall under them. So in addition to tourism marketing, we see here that destination branding is a universally critical function of Canadian DMOs. Most also serve as their community sales team for convention and meetings, as well as sports, entertainment, and other events. Canadian DMOs are more likely to be responsible for destination management functions compared to those in the US, but somewhat less likely to be responsible for the distribution of tourism research and data, although nearly 3/4 cited that as a core function. And on the next slide, here is where average annual budgets and staffing levels stood at these Canadian DMOs prior to the COVID-19 crisis. So we see 7 million and 26.6 employees. On the next slide, these are the top sources of that funding. Canadian DMOs most commonly funded by partnerships, membership fees, and government funding. And on the next slide, there's more detail on those sources of funding. I see advertising revenue and accommodations tax are also somewhat common in Canadian DMOs. Your DMOs in Canada have diversity in funding sources when we compare them to American DMOs. But important for subsequent conversations, right now, very few are receiving funds through taxes levied on Airbnb type of rentals or voluntary tax contributions from hotels. So next, let's look at the impact on the crisis. So starting with budget, and you just saw this slide, but I'll note that 90%, almost 90% of Canadian DMOs reported that their current fiscal year budget has or will decrease. And that's by 59.4% on average. And so this is showing anticipation for 2021. So half of the Canadian DMOs that we surveyed expected their 2021 fiscal year budget to decrease by an average of 41.4%. And the anticipated impact will be on each of those top funding sources that I just shared with you. And the crisis has had an unfortunate staffing impact. Over 90% of Canadian DMOs surveyed report some staffing impact due to the crisis. 86% have laid off employees. On the next slide are the average number, on the left here, average number of crisis-induced layoffs across all organizations. On the right is the average number of layoffs, just looking specifically at the organizations who did have a staffing impact. So affected Canadian DMOs laid off 10.3 staff on average. On the next slide, enduring the biggest crisis to hit our industry in modern history, let's now look at what these tourism marketing organizations see when they look ahead. So Canadian DMOs are likely to say they're indeed reviewing changes in their primary roles and responsibilities. Of those that are reviewing their primary functions, shown here on the right, over 90% of them say they're examining having an increased role in destination management in the future. Nearly 60% are also looking at an increased role in economic development. And finally, in understanding how these organizations view their role into the future, we asked their agreement with a number of different visions for the post-pandemic period. On seeking alignment with key partners, economic development, and government, there is high-level agreement, 100% among Canadians, that this will happen. And on the next slide, on their organization having a central role in improving tourism, focusing more on sustainability and resident and local business engagement. Again, we have 100% agreement from the DMOs in Canada that were surveyed. And on the next slide, similarly, nearly all the Canadian DMOs agree they're likelier to feel that this crisis will result in a new normal relative to their organization's responsibilities, funding, and staffing. And on the next slide, the concept of being smaller in addition to more focused and efficient, over 3/4 agree that they see that as their future. On the next slide, Canadian DMOs have less agreement that they'll strive to return to pre-crisis normal relative to responsibilities, fundings, and staffings. We see that our American DMOs are more likely to feel that they'll strive to get back to where they were. And finally, as it relates to seeking and developing new and more sustainable sources of funding, 2/3 of Canadian DMOs say they will be seeking new funding models. And the DMOs overall who are more likely to be on this path are organizations that have a greater number of responsibilities already and that have a more diverse set of existing funding resources and who anticipate having an increased role in economic development in the future. Should you have any questions on these findings or others we don't have time to cover today, please feel free to reach out to me at either info@destinationanalysts or Erin@destinationanalysts.com. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Erin. At Rapid Fire, we've got the full research report available on that Funding Futures website, so you can download just that research report. Obviously, we'd be delighted to look at future opportunities to maybe expand the number of Canadian DMOs involved in a study like this. So let's pass over to our crystal ball gazer, who's going to give us a sense of what tourism economics sees in terms of the economic and tourism recovery. Over to you, Adam.
Well, thanks, Chris. It takes a certain audacity to forecast right now, but let's do it anyway. Let's go through these slides together, and I'll try to hit the high points. Certainly on the pandemic side, Canada has been a relative success story in terms of certainly bending the curve down in new cases and keeping it there. But if you actually, if you look at it in comparison to other countries, it shows comparatively that Canada's done very well also. On the left-hand side, this is cases per 1,000 people, well ahead of a number of countries in Europe, and of course, markedly better than the US on this measure, with the majority of cases per capita, as you see on the right-hand side, in Quebec. On the economic front, the reality is that we are actually in the midst of a recovery. And while the second quarter was abysmal, the third quarter, once we get data for both the US and the Canadian economy, is going to be remarkably positive, simply by contrast of the second quarter. But then we're moving into a much more muted and bumpy outlook for the global and the Canadian economy. And you can see here that Oxford, our parent company, has 5 different scenarios that we've run on the global economy. And the main point I want to leave you with is that there are indeed risks to the upside and the downside, but they skew to the downside in terms of the probability as well as the range of outcomes on the downside. So we do want to bear that in mind, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty, all of it centered around the virus itself. Right now, as we've moved through the fastest part of the recovery, the Canadian economy has entered into a bit of a plateau in terms of economic momentum. And we track weekly data on what's going on in the mobility of people, employment, what's going on in sentiment and in financial markets. And you can see that after a pretty sharp rise in the late spring, early summer, that things have indeed leveled off across all measures that we're tracking in the Canadian economy. You'll see this more and more in economic data as it gets released, but this is some high frequency data that'll give you a sense for how far things have already rebounded though. Retail sales in Canada, the latest data show us rebounding to where we were in terms of percent change, but consumer confidence only about halfway in return. And I think that's indicative of that slowing, that once we've had sort of that initial comeback as the most severe of lockdowns were put behind us, that we've entered in a phase of a slower and more subdued economic outlook. The corporate side in Canada is facing 2 real challenges as we look to the recovery. The one is that company investment and profits have fallen severely. So behind the scenes of what's going on the consumer side, both company profits and business investment, you can see, have sharply dipped there in 2020. And that is going to be an enduring legacy as we move into 2021. And on the right-hand side, you see that companies are highly indebted in Canada. And so that's going to give them less latitude to endure this downturn in profits without severely cutting back on investment and on job creation. So what does this mean for travel? Let me share a couple of key findings from the modeling that we've done over the last few weeks. One, on the international side, inbound, the return of inbound is going to be slow. Borders are still closed. Best case is really where we see the second half of next year, things open up. with the advent of a vaccine and, particularly a pickup from the U.S.-Canadian border. We don't expect international travel to Canada to recover to its pre-virus levels until 2024. If it's any consolation, that's a year ahead of where we think it's going to happen for the U.S., where we think that full recovery is going to be in 2025. And we do see Canada likely to outperform the U.S. Much over the last 5 years. You can see here Canada's share of inbound travel to the combined area of the U.S. and Canada has steadily increased over the last 5 years. And some of that is a strengthening U.S. dollar. Some of it is likely connected to politics that have been very unpopular, leadership very unpopular in the U.S. But what it shows you is that Canada can indeed decouple from the U.S. And so while cases are still at a much higher level in in the U.S., we have precedent for Canada outperforming the U.S. that could really define things over the next couple of years. The first market to recover, pending the opening of borders, will be the drive market out of the U.S. You see that lighter blue line. We expect it to pick up, all of it hinging on the opening of that border, but there will be significant pent-up demand. And given how this is not a U.S. phenomenon, but certainly in the U.S. there's been a market shift to drive travel away from fly. You can see why the opportunity for Canada to attract drive travelers from the U.S. is really there, lying in wait for once that border does open. Also, I want to make a point about the opportunity on the domestic market for Canada, and primarily because the outbound market from Canada is so large. There were 35 million outbound trips from Canada in 2019 and only 22 million inbound trips. So that means that there's actually an opportunity of 13 million trips, even if inbound is completely suppressed. If those outbound trips are able to be converted into domestic trips, the Canadian economy stands to be up 13 million trips if you were to conduct a full swap. On a spending basis, you're up 21 billion Canadian dollars. So Canada does have an opportunity. Of course, there's hurdles to be crossed in order to get to this point. But nevertheless, the domestic market, not only as it currently stands, but the conversion of would-be outbound trips represents a significant opportunity for Canada to kickstart its recovery. And in fact, when we benchmark that domestic opportunity across a number of major markets, these are the top 25 outbound markets, actually Canada comes in second place, only behind the UK on this index of the domestic opportunity, where we factor in existing domestic as well as outbound. So what does this mean? This is our current outlook with STR for hotel performance across Canada. The key points on room revenue is that we get back about half of our loss in 2021, but we don't get room revenue back to where it was until about 2024. Room demand comes back a bit faster. Nevertheless, we're still looking at 2023 before hotel room demand reaches its prior peaks. So what does this mean for budgets? What does this mean for government revenue? Well, here, an interesting point in contrast to the U.S., which is that government revenues at the provincial, local, and Aboriginal level are actually much more stable than economic activity. In fact, in 2009, nominal GDP in Canada fell 5%. Now, federal tax revenue fell 6%. That's about what we expect. But subnational revenue, subnational government revenue only fell a fraction of a percent. And so when we look at 2020, while indeed GDP is forecast to fall some 5-6% and federal revenue along with it, local revenue, provincial revenue, because that relationship historically it indicates it, is likely not to fall quite as much. Another point to consider when we think about funding at the provincial level is that, in contrast to the U.S., where states are not constitutionally able to run deficits, provinces are able to run deficits. And so what it means is that there are resources available, and advocacy becomes critical for sustaining DMO budgets. And really it's paramount that DMO budgets are sustained, because roughly 1 in 4 of all jobs lost in Canada have been in the leisure and hospitality industry. And so there's no way to recover the economy of Canada without recovering the travel industry of Canada. And indeed, it will inevitably recover. The pandemic will reach its end, and the things that drove travel before it, the income levels, the demographics, the intrinsic value of a vacation, the importance of meeting together, all of those drivers are going to be fully intact on the other side. And so it's a matter of course, survival until then, but also doing all we can to accelerate that recovery. And in that regard, DMO funding is just a key part of that driver of recovery. So, Chris, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you so much for the whole team at Tourism Economics, their input into this project. So let's dive in now. I'm going to ask Tiffany to rejoin me, and we're actually going to highlight a few of those 10 euro enhanced funding options and try and provide a sort of Canadian context. So we looked at a whole range of ideas. We've grouped them into 3 types. You can see the immediate response, a variety of ways in which we can build resilience into our funding, and then exploring the idea of regeneration. And so we've pulled out a small selection, and we'll also be highlighting some of the sort of key takeaways and next steps in the recommendations phase. So let's dive into the first one, the response. And Canada's in a relatively strong position, certainly compared to the DMOs south of the border, American DMOs. Canadian DMOs have been able to access a wider range of support, and there is greater latitude, as we've just heard from Adam, of support from both federal and provincial government moving forward. And so it's going to be important through organisations like DMAC and others, to continue to be at the table arguing and accessing additional funding. And I've got some specific opportunities globally that I'll flag in the recommendations phase. Let's move along to the resilience. And I wanted to highlight a couple before I pass over to Tiffany. So short-term rental revenue, you would have seen in the research results that Erin presented, a relatively smaller percentage of Canadian DMOs are currently accessing vacation rental revenue, bed taxes on vacation rentals. We outline in the report a variety of best practices, 3 critical areas around permitting, assessment, and enforcement. And there's quite a lot of action and movement in Canada around this space. So if we have a look across Canada, in Toronto, just this week, new bylaws have come into effect, trying to manage and control the so-called ghost hotel problem, where multiple apartments are run as de facto hotels. And so better enforcement and therefore assessment is certainly going to drive revenue opportunities. If we look in Newfoundland, the Department of Tourism, Industry, Culture and Innovation is actually exploring regulation around Airbnb and other short-term rentals. And we can actually look at cities like Ottawa and, in fact, the province of Quebec for collective issues. And I think in 2019, Ottawa announced that they added $1 million of additional bed tax from their regulation and management of vacation rentals, and over $10 million Canadian was derived across the province of Quebec. So opportunities, it's obviously not introducing a new tax, it's just professionalizing the management of an existing tax. And just finally, in terms of regeneration, the third of those 3 broad themes, we explore in the study a variety of different techniques for what we call outcome-based funding and other regenerative funding models. And that can include differential fees and market pricing, where you try and incentivize certain types of travel and disincentivize others. We've got some European examples, and in fact, that European study we flagged is highlighting a variety of others, and I think we'll see a lot of movement in that coming out of it. So obviously we don't have an over-tourism problem, we have an under-tourism, but putting in place these mechanisms can help manage that growth as it returns, and also investing in some sustainability specific funds where the DMO is actively managing a proportion of the funding that is reinvested back into the community or the environment. And we've got a range of examples from around the world in that regeneration. So that could include some of the market-based pricing we see in Amsterdam, which disincentivizes, for example, day trippers into the city. Iceland has got a proportion of their bed tax being invested in new natural areas, particularly in off-season or more remote parts of the country. And so they're actually trying to drive dispersal, so helping enhance the environment, but drive dispersal by adding new walking trails or natural areas that are better managed in less visited parts of Iceland. So we've got a variety of other examples in the report as well. But let me pass over to Tiffany to highlight a few of the new and enhanced funding options that she thought were particularly pertinent to Canada.
Thank you. Reserves has been a big topic. I think in my daily transactions and conversations, we encounter this topic almost daily. The lack of reserves has crippled our organizations and thus our communities amidst this pandemic. And we've found that some bureaus have no reserves at all. Some have over a year's worth of reserves, some have more. However, most nonprofits or not-for-profits are discouraged from accumulating reserves specific to public funding. General fund dollars frequently include significant reserve restrictions. What we're finding though is that now is an opportune time to leverage our impact, our tourism industry impact on our local economies, our local sales tax, bed tax revenues, and really make an effort to change the requirements that come with general fund dollars to help us build reserves with our existing funding models. This is a picture of Memphis. Memphis has done an outstanding job. Memphis has diverse funding. One of their funding models that they use is a tourism improvement district. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but that has enabled them to be able to accumulate reserves that is going to really help them come out of the pandemic strong. The evolution of dedicated funding. Dedicated funding is really what our firm focuses on. Our firm really exists almost primarily as a result of inquiries and needs of local destinations who are experiencing either diversion of funds, deterioration of funds, or they need supplemental funding. Now we are experiencing more and more our local governments and state governments have less and less resources and are unable to really provide us the necessary resources we need in order to drive the demand that's necessary. So historically, DMO public revenue has been based on taxes, and I would say that's not just historically, that's also today. Tourism improvement districts, this is a concept in the United States. It has been around since 1990. It evolved from the business improvement district concept, very similar to your BIA. In 2010, there was the emergence of culinary districts. So tourism improvement districts are primarily assessments on one classification of business, namely lodging or hotel businesses. We're now seeing TIDs form specific to different classifications of business, one being restaurants, another specific to attractions. We do have snow/ski districts. We have golf districts. Now we are forming some wine marketing districts in California, and the very first cannabis improvement district in California as well. There's been an evolution of the name of the tourism improvement district in the United States. It is now the Tourism Recovery and Improvement District. There has been an evolution of the application of these districts amidst the pandemic. We want to highlight Toronto. Toronto recently was able to secure prioritized DMO funding. And what that means is they have secured 100% of their municipal accommodation tax revenue to fund their DMO. This is an initiative that DMAC has slated for their 2021 initiatives. And we can talk a bit more about that with Kathleen on the panel. Talking a bit about TRIDs and how that compares to your DMFs, they're similar models in that they're private models. There is a levy on the hotel room night, and that is then collected, remitted back to the local government, which is then remitted back to the destination marketing organization. There's a couple of differences in the TID model in the US versus Canada. In US, it is primarily compulsory. So when these are formed, they are formed for a term. The term is typically 5 to 10 years at the outset. We are finding TRIDs with recovery are about 3 years to 5 years in initial formation. So again, they're set for a defined term, and that information, those requirements are specifically outlined in the recovery plan, which is composed and passed by the hotels. We'll talk a bit about TIF financing. Again, this is a United States model. It's quite popular specifically for capital improvements usually. And what it is where typically sales tax is identified as the base tax. There's a line drawn at a particular amount of collection. Any growth above and beyond that collection is then dedicated back to a particular project. There have been some models of TIF financing funding tourism. We have had some statewide models. Couple of challenges with this model. They often still involve discretionary approvals, and to implement them, at least in the United States, they do require state legislation, which is a significant effort.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tiffany. Let's quickly go through the recommendations so we can get to the panel discussion. And we've got a whole variety of recommendations in the full report. Just a few we wanted to highlight. This critical issue over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months of exhausting federal, provincial, local government support and being at the table with the likes of DMAC to advocate for more. I wanted to highlight resources from around the world. So the OECD and the UNWTO have kept a monitor, and as we can see here, I've actually got these resources in the full report. You can visit a comprehensive library to see the sort of support that is available to DMOs all around the world. And so this is an opportunity to really learn, benchmark, and bring to those discussions with our government partners ideas from other parts of the world that are grappling with exactly the same issue. We also want to be using this as an opportunity to review our role and relevance and responsibility. Canadian destinations were almost universal in saying they wanted to take this sort of reimagination of their responsibilities. And so that could be quite tactical around reshaping, for example, a DMF into potentially a more resilient funding model, whether that be a TID or something else. It could be obviously exploring closer economic development roles, destination management, where there's strong interest. And in fact, some Canadian destinations are doing some really innovative activities in that space. Destinations International have advocated for so-called community shared values, where you partner with what they call unusual suspects, universities, employers, property developers, and others. Particularly important, I think, in urban areas where, you know, downturn in tourism, meetings, business travel has been pronounced, really building these broader partnerships. And we also talked about those regenerative funding streams and looking at building back and adding that as a component in how we're collecting and using funding. Throughout this whole process, we want to access the best available research and data. And in the full report, we've got a variety of really incredible resources and information you can access. Destination Canada, of course, has got some great information. The various 6 regional economic development agencies are also collecting and sharing. So please make sure that you go to your partners and are involved in those discussions with the latest and most comprehensive insights. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you. So we want to make sure that we highlight a couple of key elements that we think are a little bit more innovative, modern takes on existing funding challenges. So many DMOs are taking advantage of current challenges by negotiating with their municipalities a rolling average So the concept of a rolling average is taking the last 3 or 4 years of collections, averaging those, and that dispersing those as your allocations back to your organizations. We also want to revisit the discussion around reserves, developing meaningful reserves, private-public insurance models, orchestrate a well-planned campaign to improve the predictability of your revenue and manage your risks for your partners. Exploring additional funding streams, we've reviewed the US concept of a tourism improvement district or recovery district, short-term rental revenues, just a couple of key destinations in Canada that have done really well with that. We know Newfoundland is embarking on that, and regenerative funding models.
Okay, so just before we pass over to the poll, which, to the panel, which Tiffany's going to be moderating, let's run a poll. And so if you could respond, we've put 7 of these new or enhanced funding options up here. We want you to identify up to 3, could be 1, 2, or 3 of these that you think are of particular priority to you. So you should see the poll on your screen. Tick 1, 2, or 3 of these as priorities, and we'll have a look at the results. We'll just give you another 5 to 10 seconds to respond. And hopefully we'll have opportunities for questions at the end. So please use the Q&A function to send in your questions. We hopefully after the panel will just have a few minutes to address those. So let's have a look at the poll results. So this whole issue and we saw this in the research, the role, responsibility, and structure of DMOs, really going back to the meaning, purpose, and structure of your organizations. You can see that's critically important. The short to medium term urgency of recovery funding and stimulus spending, taking advantage of the federal, provincial, the 6 economic development agencies, their support, the so-called recovery funding through them, and you can see also there's interest in building reserves. So take a look at the full report, but that gives you a sense of what Canadian DMOs are thinking right now. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Tiffany. We'll come back in about 10, 12 minutes or so for a final Q&A, but over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. If you could, thank you. Turn on your cameras. Thank you. It's lovely to see all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Your expertise, your experience is critical, and I think can be very helpful to those listening in. So Royce Trinh, President and CEO of Tourism Vancouver. Thank you for joining us. Kathy Duke, President and CEO of Destination St. John, Newfoundland and Labrador. And Kathleen Trainer, Executive Director of Tourism Barrie and President of DMAC. Thank you for your time. Kathleen, if it's okay, I'd love to begin with you. You have unique insight into many challenges across Canada because you have 385 members, I think you said, in your organization. What do you think are the key takeaways from today's webinar for funding futures of Canadian DMOs?
Well, thank you, Tiffany. And every page in the report was full of information, and so it was hard to pick out the top 3. But the top 3 takeaways I gathered from the report, which I will also bring forward to DMAC members, is 1, the DMOs in Canada are in a good position to be looking at the best practices and new funding models and opportunities out of Europe and the USA. Like many industries, there is a disruption in tourism, and we need to make some changes and change some of our models and taking a new modern approach to how DMOs are funded and aligning with economic development. I found the recommendations in there. That was one of my top. The second takeaway is DMOs that funding arrives from an accommodation tax need to have at least 1 year in reserve funding. Municipal and provincial government bodies that regulate funding to the DMOs need to change their spend it or lose it mindset and allow for DMOs to have at least 1 year operating expenses in a reserve fund. DMOs across Canada need to be unified in the message that we need to have reserve funds and be ready for the next pandemic and natural disaster. The third takeaway, and the most important for me, is the need for DMOs to diversify their revenue sources. The report has very interesting recommendations and opportunities for DMO to think about and to certainly act upon.
Very good. Thank you so much for that contribution. I'd like to talk a bit about the practical application of those highlighted takeaways. If I can, Royce, if it's all right, I'll begin with you. We spoke yesterday at length about the evolution of the DMO from a destination marketing organization to a destination management organization, and now the ever more obvious role that tourism is playing in our local economies and our communities. From your vantage point, what opportunities can DMOs harness as the outcome, and how could this translate to future funding opportunities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess, you know, they say when you're lying on the floor, the only way that you can go up. So how do we get up from this? And I'd start with the last page of the executive summary report that'll come out, and it says, make sure they understand what you do. And I would maybe change that to say, make sure they understand and appreciate your value add. And I'd refer back in that comment that you made about destination marketing organizations versus destination management or destination stewardship by saying that I think historically for many kinds of businesses beyond DMOs, marketing has always been considered an expense. And if it's an expense, it's easy to cut. So how do we transform the value add that we've actually been delivering, I think, for years, but we ourselves as pro marketers have not done a great job at marketing. And that is, we're not just about bringing tourists in, but we're here to build a triple bottom line around people, planet, and profit. How do we use the reality, the lived experience that we're living in right now to provide the evidence to say, here's the value add that a destination management organization has for a city, a community, a region, and we are part of the solution that will be required to rebuild economic stability. So therefore, this is not an expense to market, but investment in managed growth. And I think words matter. And if I might finally say, as good as marketers as we are, if we are using our language to market to policymakers and politicians, then I don't think we've read our audiences very well. And perhaps it starts with the change of language, which will then get to the business problem, one of the business problems we're trying to solve, and that is to secure a better source of predictable, sustainable funding revenue or investment revenue.
So it's interesting that you ended with that. I think that was actually my next question was, you know, how do you recommend bridging that relationship? And if there's a break in that, how do you bridge that? And you change the language. Is there anything else you might add to that in order to really get municipalities to really understand tourism's role in economic development?
Yeah, I think it's broadening the scope of tourism and changing some of the language, because when we talk about what we do, at least what I've found and what we've found in the conversation, when we talk about marketing, it naturally excludes a bunch of businesses and at the civic level, their engagement in the place. This is about destination promotion, which now requires the entire community to be involved in that. So this is about bringing more on board versus expertise in the swim lane. As a result, what's the broader economic impact of the investment through tourism as one of the economic levers that actually benefits that triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit? It can't just be about making more margaritas by the pool. It's got to be broader than that. And more community feels involved, perhaps you start to influence the support as investment versus expense. We need to change our language.
Interesting. And so you see other industries coming into this discussion and other industries engaging with your organization for that initiative. Is that right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're talking about destination competitiveness, it can't just be about tourism. It's about what a destination as a whole society has to offer.
Sure.
And those that don't step into that and collaborate are the perfect targets for those destinations that are collaborating, that are finding the points of alignment, because, you know, truth is we're not going to align on everything, but let's find the best points of alignment that have a betterment for the entire community for which we serve.
Thank you. Kathy, I know you also have your own perspective on this. I know you have some experience also in this space. So anything that you would add and recommendations to those who are listening on how to begin those conversations and how to begin to translate the impact of tourism on local economies?
Yeah, I think there are, actually kind of two elements in here for me, particularly in this environment now and during the pandemic. I think for a lot of us, we're looking now at risk management that perhaps we weren't looking at as closely as we should have in the past. Here in St. John's, we've been heavily dependent on the room tax, perhaps more than most DMOs, and that's been a big risk factor for us. We have built reserve funds over the years, so that was a good thing. But I think the area that really we probably had a weakness in that we now need to pursue is those kinds of partnerships that Royce is talking about, and particularly with our municipality. We've over the years learned, and I guess as many DMOs have, that marketing is a very important element of what we do, but we now realize that destination development is an equally important component, and that the two are a part of one larger effort. And so we've been moving more into destination development. And I think that's an area that our municipalities and other stakeholders in the community can buy into, because not everybody needs to market, and there's a certain skill set and things that need to happen. But when it comes to the mandate of our municipal government, some things our university is involved in, some of our nonprofit organizations, we all can feed into that product that becomes our own, that the thing that makes us unique and what we're all about. There's an expression that I've heard, a good place to live is a good place to visit. And I think that's where you bring in the whole community. So I think that although we've had a wonderful relationship with our municipal government, we haven't really partnered in that way to engage them at that level. So I think for us, there's a great opportunity to do that. And then it does help us resolve the other challenge, which is in terms of risk management, in terms of ensuring we have sustainability and a future that is not, we don't put all our eggs in one basket. And I think maybe we've done that for a little bit too long because it's worked for us.
Yes, it's worked for us, and we have a captive audience, right? We have those who work with us, who understand what we do, and so it's challenging to bring others into that conversation. Yeah. So talking about landscape and community, we have probably one of the biggest discussions we have now is around short-term rentals. And we know, we highlighted earlier in the webinar that Newfoundland has introduced legislation around registering short-term rentals and then also collecting taxes and fees from short-term rentals. Can you tell us, and we know that this initiative is relatively new in Canada and there's only been 1 or 2 successful passings. Can you talk to us a bit about what it took to put that together and how you see it evolving in your destination? And also, how does that translate to your organization and ultimately to destination marketing and development?
Yeah, well, certainly here in St. John's, it's been a huge factor for us. Short-term rentals have grown exponentially in the city, as they have in most cities in Canada. But I think what we also realize, and our provincial government realized, is that there's been an extreme impact on small communities where there are licensed accommodators, small B&Bs and inns that were losing all their business to short-term rentals in their community that were popping up all over the place. So while we were lobbying the province for some time to assist us in the city, we have a legislative accommodation tax here. And of course, all of the short-term rentals that exist here aren't paying the accommodation tax or aren't getting the permits and licenses and paying all the other taxes. But we're really pleased that the province listened, and they listened to industry and did a pretty wide consultation. And they did announce this summer that they're introducing legislation. And it's actually, I should say, it isn't actually passed yet, but they have committed to bringing legislation to the House of Assembly to put in place a framework. And at this time, they're doing some additional consultations. with industry, which will finish now the end of this month. But they're talking about basically requiring all roofed accommodations outside of a primary residence to register with the Department of Tourism. So they're basically licensed. That needs to be reflected in all of their promotions. There are fines in place if that, in terms of compliance. And there's also a view to ensuring certain quality assurance standards, which are really important to us. So we're really optimistic about it. I don't think we're necessarily leaders in the country, because certainly Vancouver, Toronto, Victoria, other cities have put some really excellent, frameworks around those. And the province of Quebec, I think back in 2017, was probably one of the first to put it in place. Monitoring compliance is always an issue, but we're really pleased. It will be a provincial legislation, so that it will affect every, operator in every community in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we're hoping that maybe before Christmas that will be approved, and we'll get down to the details of the regulations and so on. So we're really pleased with that.
Royce, you've had experience in this space as well. What are your thoughts on this relatively new concept and how it is and how it can impact tourism in the future?
Yeah, I think it would be an understatement to say that it's certainly caused a lot of tension in the tourism community, the STRs and the residents, as a result of technology. And so, whether or not we use the expression of leveling the playing field, or we flip the expression and say, how do we respond to the traveler? The traveler is demanding this. Technology has enabled it. How do we figure out a way to best work together to harness this for the betterment of the destination, recognizing the partners involved, like our hotel partners, like our communities where these places exist, these short-term rentals? How do you work with municipal government to manage it? And I think that's going to be the great social experiment over the next decade. I would not want to hazard the guess, other than it's going to happen. It's not going to stop happening. How do we try to get in front of it? And I applaud Vancouver for getting on the ball with this a short time ago, back in 2008, to try to catch up, if you will. So there's no point in trying to fight it. How do you harness it? How do you try to figure it out as part of the broader partnership, recognizing, again, you've got so many other existing historical partners in play, and trying to find some equity in how we work together.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your time. We'll leave a few minutes for questions, so I'll turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Yes, and let's perhaps just ask one final question. And Erin, perhaps if you could join us for this, I'll just ask each of the panelists. Sally is asking if we had to focus on one thing over the next month, what is going to be your priority coming out of what you're thinking about in terms of funding or what you've seen in this report? So perhaps Kathleen, I'll start with you.
I'd certainly be, I'd like to use other areas as precedents. So I'll be certainly looking at what the US and Europe and some of in the reports, and looking what they're doing and grabbing their best practices. And I like to say, well, this is what Amsterdam does. And so that's what I'll be looking at, to see their best practices, and then bringing that back to DMAC. And hopefully we, as a united Canadian DMO Association, come back and see if we can have the top 5 or something. So I think that's what I'd like to be doing.
Yeah, and we've got dozens of examples in there, and that European study, as I flagged, will include dozens more. Erin, you led the research effort. What was one critical thing you think DMOs should be focusing on over the next month or so?
I think not getting too distracted with things and staying really focused on what their core value is to their community and to their biggest audience, which is the traveling consumer.
Very good. Royce, what would you leave us with?
This is really about advocacy for industry for us. That's one of our #1 priorities. If we don't have anything left to build a destination around, what do we have? So it's really around GR, government relations.
Very good. And I think it tests, doesn't it, the quality of those relationships you've built in the years leading up to this crisis. So Kathy, what's your final thought?
Well, mine actually I think builds upon what Royce has said. I think that we were very successful in tapping into the recovery programs for 2020. In 2021, really for me, it's a sustainability model. And I think a lot of that is engaging with our city and with the province and those relationships, I guess, that Royce is talking about. So it has to be sustainability for us, but it's going to be a new way. It's going to be in those partnerships and with other stakeholders. So I think that would be our priority.
Thank you. And we've run out of time, so let's wrap it up by thanking all of our wonderful panelists and presenters today. Thanks so much for your time. To our agency partners, our supporters, including DMAC. Thank you again, Kathleen, to the whole team there, and to all of you for joining us. So whether you're in Victoria or Newfoundland, wherever you are across Canada, stay safe, stay well, and we look forward to connecting in person at some point in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.